Hi everyone, this is Dr. Orkun Baycik and today we are going to talk about interval estimation. So we are going to talk about how to create confidence intervals or interval estimates, but the point within confidence intervals is that we want to create these intervals to be able to measure how close a point estimate is to the true population parameter. We don't know what the true population parameter is, but we are trying to use a measure to see how close we are to that true value. So we are going to use something called a point estimator, and that will be a sample statistic that we use to estimate a population parameter. For example, if I want to create an interval for the population mean, then my point estimator would be the sample mean. Okay, so if I'm creating this interval on the population proportion, then my point estimator would be the sample proportion. And the general form of an interval estimate is this red part at the bottom. So we will have the point estimate, and we are going to add and subtract a margin of error from this point estimate to get our confidence interval. And we are going to focus on two cases where we know the population standard deviation, which is denoted by sigma. And the second case is that we don't know the population standard deviation sigma. So let's look at an example. So in this case, we are going to focus on the situation where we know the population standard deviation sigma. Okay? So suppose that I have a furniture store and we want to predict the amount of time the customers spend in our store per shopping trip. And we collected data on 150 customers and we wanted to see the average amount of time they spent in our store, and this value is given to be 8.7 minutes. So based on the sample on 150 customers, the average time spent per shopping trip is 8.7 minutes. And we assume that we know the population standard deviation sigma, and it is equal to 2.6 minutes. And the question is asking us to create a 95% confidence interval for the true average time spent per shopping trip. So what is this asking is essentially construct a confidence interval on the population mean. Okay? So this is the case again where we know the population standard deviation, which is not usually the case, but just to understand how to create confidence intervals for situations like this, we are going to look at this example. So when it comes to confidence intervals, I like to create a template, as you can see on the left hand side of the screen, and I basically plug in my values, and then using those values I create my confidence interval. So first of all, what is the sample mean? The sample mean is given to be 8.7 minutes, so I will put it on my template. What is the sample size? So we collected a data set on 150 customers, therefore my sample size is 150. The confidence level is 95% or 0.95 as given by the question. And then alpha, in other words, the significance level is going to be equal to 1 minus the confidence level. So in this case, the alpha value is 0.05. And the last piece of information I need to provide is the population standard deviation, which is given in the question as 2.6 minutes. Okay? So what I did so far is to basically put in what I know about my problem. And now I'm going to calculate something called the margin of error, which I will add and subtract from my point estimate, which is the sample mean in this case. Again, remember, the point estimate is going to be helpful to create an interval on the true mean. Okay? So the point estimator is the sample mean, and I'm going to use the sample mean to create an interval on the true population mean. So to calculate the margin of error, I'm going to use a function called confidence.norm. Okay? So we are going to use confidence.norm for the cases where we know the population standard deviation. Okay? And this function requires three different values, which are alpha, the standard deviation, and the sample size. So alpha is in my template, which is 0.05. The standard deviation of the population is 2.6, and the sample size is 150. Okay, so I plug in these values, and then the result of this is going to give me my margin of error, and I'm going to create a lower bound and an upper bound on my interval. And to do that, I'm going to first calculate my lower bound by subtracting the margin of error from the sample mean. So B1 is my sample mean minus B8, which is my margin of error. That gives me the lower bound for this confidence interval. And the upper bound will be the sample mean plus the margin of error B8. So the upper bound of my confidence interval is 9.11. So based on these calculations, what we are going to say is that we conclude that we are 95% confident that the true average time spent per shopping trip is within the interval of 8.28 and 9.12. Okay, so we are going to say that we are 95% confident that the true average time spent per shopping trip is within the interval of 8.28 and 9.12. So this is the case where we know the population standard deviation. So now let's look at the second situation where we don't know the population standard deviation, but we have the sample data, and we are going to use the sample to estimate the confidence interval that includes the population mean. So in this example, suppose that we own a furniture store and we want to predict the amount of time the customers spend in our store per shopping trip, and we collected this data, which is given on our worksheet, on 40 customers, and we want to create a 95% confidence interval for the true average time spent per shopping trip. Okay, so I have my data set. I have 40 values in this data set, which means that my sample size is 40. Okay, so that is given. And I need to find the sample mean, and I know how to do it because I can use the average function to calculate the sample mean. So that value will be 11.0025, and then the confidence level is 95% or 0.95, similar to the previous example. Therefore, the alpha or significance level will be equal to 0.05. And then I need to calculate the sample standard deviation by using my sample data. So I have my sample data, I calculated the sample mean, and now I'm going to use the standard deviation for the sample function on Excel to calculate this value. So I'm going to use the function for the sample standard deviation and then input the data into it, which will give me the standard deviation of 4.93. Okay. So in this case, when we don't know the population standard deviation, we are going to use a distribution called the t-distribution. And the function that we use to calculate the margin of error is called confidence.t. And in this case, again, we need alpha, we need standard deviation, and we need the sample size. Alpha is 0.05. The standard deviation of the sample is 4.93. And the sample size is 40. So after I input all these values, I am ready to calculate the margin of error, and that will be 1.57. And again, similar to the previous approach, we are going to do the sample mean minus the margin of error to calculate the lower bound, and we are going to do sample mean plus the margin of error to calculate the upper bound. So the sample mean minus the margin of error, that is my lower bound, and then the sample mean plus the margin of error is my upper bound. Okay? So based on this result, what I can conclude is we are 95% confident that the interval 9.42 to 12.57 includes the true average time spent per shopping trip. Okay, so in this video, we looked at the two different cases of the population standard deviation known and population standard deviation unknown when we are creating confidence intervals on the population mean. And we went through two examples and we looked at how we can use Excel functions to calculate and create these confidence intervals. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.